Michael Carter adjusted the collar of his jacket as he entered the electronics store. The air was crisp outside, a typical fall morning in this Midwestern town. Inside, the warmth enveloped him, along with the familiar buzz of a store that thrived on the latest technology. He felt out of place but kept his composure. Today wasn't a regular day for Michael, it was the day he allowed himself to be like everyone else, a civilian, just buying a new phone. "Morning, sir. How can I help you today?" a young sales clerk greeted him as he stepped up to the counter. "I'm looking for something reliable." "My old phone finally gave up on me," Michael responded, his voice calm but commanding. He glanced around the store, noticing a few other customers engrossed in the displays. The clerk gave a nod. "Well, we've got the latest models right here. How about the new Galaxy?" As the clerk laid out the options, Michael's eyes briefly caught a reflection of himself in the store's glass window, a tall, broad-shouldered black man in his early 40s, with a presence that demanded respect. Though off-duty, his instinct to observe never took a break. He noticed two officers parked across the street, glancing his way. The tension in his chest tightened. Michael listened to the clerk's rundown, but his mind was on those cops outside. Just 2 months ago, he had been promoted to chief of police, although his start date wasn't until next week. He had planned this as a quiet morning, one where he could ease into his new town and get a feel for the place without the uniform. "I'll take it," Michael finally said, handing his card to the clerk, who smiled, eager for the commission. As Michael stepped out of the store, phone in hand, the two officers from earlier were now leaning against their squad car. They weren't just watching anymore, they were moving towards him. "Hey! Hold up a minute," one of them called out. It wasn't a request. Michael paused. Every instinct told him this wasn't going to be good, but he kept his hands visible, the bag with his new phone still dangling from his wrist. "Everything all right, officers?" he asked, his voice steady but firm. The younger of the two, Officer Roberts, barely glanced at Michael's face. "We've had some reports of theft around here. Mind telling us what you got in the bag?" Michael's eyes narrowed, but he stayed calm. "Just made a purchase. Got the receipt right here," he said, reaching slowly into his jacket pocket. The second officer, Parker, stepped closer. "How about you just let us take a look? Could be stolen goods, you know." Michael hesitated. He wasn't about to let this escalate, but the insinuation was clear. "Officers, I assure you, this phone was just bought. I have the receipt." Roberts exchanged a look with Parker, then grabbed the bag from Michael's hand, tearing it open as if the receipt didn't matter. Michael clenched his fists but didn't react further. His mind flashed to the irony of it all, the chief of police, accused of stealing a phone he had just bought, in his own jurisdiction. "What's this?" Parker pulled out the box, shaking his head. "This looks real suspicious to me." Without warning, Roberts grabbed Michael's arm. "Turn around." Michael froze for a second. This was happening. His breath quickened, but his voice remained level. "You're making a mistake." But the officers didn't stop. In seconds, Michael's wrists were roughly pulled behind him, and the cold, metallic click of handcuffs snapped against his skin. His chest tightened, anger bubbling beneath his calm exterior. He looked up, seeing the small crowd that had gathered to watch, regular people, eyes wide with a mix of curiosity and indifference. Not a single one intervened. "Let's go," Robert said, shoving him toward the patrol car. Michael's heart raced, but he forced himself to stay composed. If he resisted now, it would only confirm their bias. And yet, there was an almost unbearable humiliation in being shoved into the back of a squad car, as if he were no different from the criminals he had spent his life bringing to justice. As the car door slammed shut, the sound reverberated through Michael's mind. He had spent decades building his career, working his way through a system that was rigged against men like him. And now, in a matter of minutes, he was reduced to this, just another black man in handcuffs. The two officers exchanged casual conversation in the front seat, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. "So, where's this thief from?" Parker asked, turning the wheel as they pulled away from the electronics store. "Out of town, I bet," Roberts responded, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror where Michael sat, his face unreadable. "Probably came here thinking he could get away with it." Michael said nothing. He stared straight ahead, the buildings of the small town blurring together as they sped down the road. It would take just one word from him to end this, to tell them who he really was. But he wasn't ready to play that card yet. Instead, he let them dig their hole deeper, let them show him just how deep the rot in this department ran. The car slowed as they reached the station. Michael took a deep breath, bracing himself for what was next. The station was just as he remembered it, cold, impersonal, with the oppressive weight of bureaucracy hanging in the air. As the door opened, he stepped out, his muscles tight from the tension. Roberts guided him toward the back entrance. "We'll get this sorted out. You sit tight." Michael was led through the dimly lit hallways, past rows of desks where officers barely glanced his way. He could feel the eyes of the few who did, a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and in some cases, disdain. He was placed in a holding room, the door slamming behind him with a heavy finality. Sitting on the hard, metal bench, Michael's thoughts raced. He knew he could make this stop at any moment, he could demand his rights, call in favors, pull rank. But something inside him wanted to see how far this would go. It was an ugly curiosity, one that simmered beneath his usually composed demeanor. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Finally, the door creaked open, and a new face entered, Sergeant Lewis. Older, more seasoned, with a face lined by years of experience, he looked different from the other officers. His steps were deliberate, his expression guarded. "Carter, huh?" Lewis began, his voice low, as he scanned the paperwork in his hand. "Doesn't seem right to me." Michael raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "Look," Lewis said, sitting down across from him. "I don't know what happened out there, but something's not adding up. These two said you stole a phone, but you've got the receipt right here." He held up the crumpled paper, a small, insignificant thing that carried so much weight now. Michael leaned back, studying the man in front of him. He could sense that Lewis wasn't like the others. There was something more, whether it was caution or guilt, he couldn't tell. "Tell me," Michael finally spoke, his voice calm but laced with authority, "do you know who I am?" Lewis's eyes flicked up, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. He opened his mouth to respond, but just as he was about to speak, the door burst open. Parker and Roberts stood there, their faces pale as if they had seen a ghost. "We need to talk," Parker stammered, his voice shaky. "Now." The ride in the back of the police car was suffocating. Michael sat silently, his hands still cuffed, the cold metal digging into his wrists. Parker and Roberts exchanged casual conversation up front, as if their latest arrest was just another day on the job. The occasional snicker slipped from their lips, and it grated on Michael's nerves. "Guy thought he could just walk out of there, huh?" Parker chuckled, adjusting his grip on the steering wheel. Roberts smirked, turning slightly in his seat to glance at Michael through the rearview mirror. "They all think that, don't they? Comes with the territory." Michael's jaw tightened, but he kept his eyes forward. Years in law enforcement had taught him patience. Reacting now would do no good. He needed to understand just how deep this rot went. How much of this department was poisoned by the same mindset. He'd soon find out, but for now, he let them talk, let them dig themselves deeper. "You've been around for a while, right?" Roberts asked, addressing Parker. "Yeah, 15 years. Seen it all, man," Parker replied, voice casual, as if they weren't riding with their soon-to-be boss handcuffed in the back seat. Roberts snickered. "Bet you've seen worse than this guy." Parker shot a glance at Michael, nodding. "Oh, you don't know the half of it." They all got the same excuses, same sob stories. And you give M an inch, well, you know how it goes. Michael couldn't resist anymore. His voice cut through the car, cool and steady. You don't even know who I am. Parker's eyes flicked to the mirror, then to Robert's, a cocky grin forming on his face. Oh, we know exactly who you are. Roberts nodded, amused. Yeah, another guy who thought he could outsmart the law. Michael leaned forward slightly, the restraint of the cuffs forcing his posture to stay rigid. I don't think you do. But you'll find out soon enough. The two officers exchanged glances, their grins faltering for a second. But the arrogance returned just as quickly. We'll see, Parker muttered as they pulled into the station's parking lot. The police station loomed in front of them, an old, gray building that had seen better days. Its facade reflected the very thing Michael had been warned about before he took this job, a system that had become stagnant, corrupted by those meant to uphold it. As the car rolled to a stop, Roberts was the first to get out. He moved around to Michael's door and yanked it open. Out. Michael complied, stepping out carefully, the tightness of the cuffs reminding him of how this town's justice system really worked. Parker walked behind him, not bothering to loosen the restraints as they marched toward the building's entrance. Got ourselves a real prize today, Parker joked to the officer at the front desk as they entered the station. The officer looked up, a flicker of curiosity crossing his face, but he didn't say anything. Michael took note of his silence. Did everyone here play the same game? Let's get him processed, Roberts said, leading Michael down a dimly lit hallway that smelled faintly of old coffee and sweat. The walls were lined with yellowing posters about community programs, all of which seemed ironic now. Roberts shoved him into a small holding room at the end of the corridor and locked the door behind him. Sit tight. We'll see what the system's got for you, Roberts sneered before disappearing down the hall with Parker. Michael sat down on the cold, hard bench, his hands still cuffed behind him. He exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of his predicament. He knew that once they figured out who he was, things would change, but how much damage had already been done? How much of their arrogance could be undone with a single revelation? Time passed slowly, minutes dragging into what felt like hours. The silence of the holding room gave Michael time to reflect. The arrogance, the casual racism he'd heard on the ride, it wasn't just two bad apples. This was a culture. One he was going to have to dismantle from the inside out. The door creaked open, and Sergeant Lewis stepped in. Michael recognized him immediately, an older man with gray hair, glasses perched on his nose, and a face that had seen its fair share of battles. But there was something different about him, something quieter. Lewis stood there for a moment, observing Michael. His eyes flicked to the cuffs, then back to Michael's face. They really brought you in like this? Michael didn't respond right away, waiting for Lewis to make the first move. Lewis sighed heavily, pulling a chair from the corner and sitting across from Michael. Look, I don't know what happened out there, but something doesn't sit right with me. Michael finally spoke, his voice even. And what would that be, Sergeant? Lewis glanced at the paperwork he had brought with him. Your record. The receipt. The whole thing seems off. He met Michael's gaze, his expression conflicted. Who are you really? Michael's lips curled slightly, but he didn't answer. He wasn't going to make this easy. He wanted to see how long it would take for Lewis to figure it out, for the rest of them to scramble to fix this mess they'd created. Before Lewis could press further, the door burst open again. Parker and Robert stormed in, their faces pale, the cockiness completely drained from them. We need to talk, Parker stammered, his bravado gone. Now. Lewis stood, eyebrows furrowed. What's going on? Roberts shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Michael, then back to Lewis. We ran his ID, and, well, there's been a mistake. Michael leaned back, watching them sweat, their panic barely contained. Lewis folded his arms, his tone turning cold. What kind of mistake? Parker cleared his throat, struggling to find the right words. He's not who we thought. Roberts cut him off, blurting it out. He's the new chief of police. The room fell into a heavy silence. Lewis's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment, he just stared at Michael, processing what had just been said. Michael finally broke the silence, his voice calm but piercing. Now you know. Lewis looked down, guilt flashing across his face. Jesus. Parker, clearly shaken, tried to recover. We didn't know. We didn't. Michael stood up, the weight of the cuffs on his wrists suddenly feeling lighter. He turned to Parker and Roberts, his voice deadly quiet. You didn't know. Or you didn't care. Parker stammered, but nothing coherent came out. Roberts just stood there, his face pale as a sheet. Michael stepped closer, his presence filling the room. I'm going to give you one chance to explain yourselves. One chance to tell me how you thought this was okay. Roberts finally found his voice, but it was weak. We thought. I mean, there's been some thefts recently. We were just doing our job. Your job. Michael's voice rose, controlled but sharp. Your job is to protect and serve. Not to assume. Not to arrest without cause. And definitely not to throw a man in cuffs without so much as asking for an explanation. Parker's face was flushed now, his arrogance completely shattered. We didn't mean for this to happen. Michael shook his head, his tone icy. But it did. And now you'll have to face the consequences. Lewis, still standing in the corner, finally spoke. Chief. I had no idea. If I'd known, I would've. Michael cut him off, his eyes flashing with authority. You would've what, Sergeant? Stepped in. Or would you have stayed silent like you did this whole time? Lewis looked down at the floor, guilt etched into his features. I should have known better. Michael turned to leave, his voice calm but commanding. We're not done here. Not by a long shot. As he reached the door, he looked back at the three officers. I'll be in touch. And when I am, you'll wish you had done things differently. With that, he walked out of the room, leaving them in stunned silence. Michael stood outside the interrogation room, the weight of the past hours sinking in. He was about to face the very officers who had humiliated him, who had shown him what this department really was beneath the surface. He took a deep breath and pushed open the door. Inside, Parker and Roberts sat at the metal table, fidgeting nervously. Their once arrogant faces were now pale, the gravity of the situation finally hitting them. Sergeant Lewis stood in the corner, arms crossed, his face unreadable but tense. Chief, Parker started, his voice shaky, we didn't know, we didn't. Michael cut him off, his voice cold and deliberate. You didn't care. That's the problem. The room fell into an awkward silence. Parker and Roberts exchanged uneasy glances, both unsure of what to say. Michael remained standing, his imposing figure casting a long shadow across the small room. Roberts, always the more brazen of the two, spoke up. Look, it wasn't personal. We were just doing our job. We've had a string of thefts in the area, and what? Michael's voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. You thought I fit the description? Roberts faltered. No, You thought because I'm a black man, walking out of a store with a bag in my hand, that I must be a criminal? Michael's tone was controlled but heavy with emotion. He wasn't yelling, but the intensity of his words filled the room with an uncomfortable weight. Parker, desperate to defuse the situation, leaned forward. Chief, we made a mistake. A big one. But it wasn't about race, I swear. Michael took a step forward, his eyes locked onto Parker's. Do you even hear yourself? This was entirely about race. And the fact that you can't see that is exactly why you're sitting here right now. The room was silent again. Sergeant Lewis, who had been observing quietly, finally spoke. "Chief Carter, if I may, these men, they're good officers. They made a mistake, yes, but they've served this department well." Michael turned his gaze to Lewis, his voice soft but firm. "A mistake? This wasn't just a mistake, Sergeant. This was systemic. And if we let them walk away without facing the consequences, it will keep happening. To someone else. Someone who may not have the power to stand up for themselves." Lewis looked down, guilt flickering across his face. He knew Michael was right. This wasn't just about one bad decision. It was about a culture that had been allowed to fester unchecked. Michael exhaled, turning his attention back to Parker and Roberts. "You know, I wasn't going to make a scene. I wasn't going to pull rank or embarrass you in front of the station. But now I see how deep this problem goes. And it's my responsibility to fix it." Roberts, now visibly sweating, stammered. "What are you going to do?" Michael leaned in, his voice lowering to a near whisper. "I could have you both fired. Today. I could bring charges against you for misconduct, for abuse of power. And you'd lose everything." Parker swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly. "Please, Chief, we didn't mean for it to go this far. We thought we were doing our jobs." Michael straightened up, his gaze never wavering. "Your job is to protect and serve. But you only serve people who look like you. That ends today." Roberts's eyes widened in panic. "You're not gonna fire us, are you?" "Chief, please, we'll do anything." Michael crossed his arms, studying them. "Anything?" Both officers nodded vigorously, their desperation palpable. Michael let the silence hang in the air for a moment before speaking again. "I'm not going to fire you. Not yet. But you're going to pay for what you've done. You're going to take a long, hard look at the way you treat people. Starting tomorrow, you'll be working under me, directly. I'll be watching every move you make." Roberts opened his mouth to protest, but Michael held up a hand to stop him. "You will attend sensitivity training, community engagement projects, and racial bias workshops. And if I hear even a whisper of you stepping out of line, you're done. Is that clear?" Parker nodded quickly, but Roberts still looked skeptical. "And what if we refuse?" Michael's eyes narrowed. "Then I will have no problem tearing your career apart, brick by brick." Roberts fell silent, the fight draining out of him. Sergeant Lewis, sensing the tension, stepped forward. "Chief, I understand where you're coming from. But maybe we could find a more collaborative solution. These men can change, but they need the right guidance." Michael's jaw tightened. "Guidance? That's what you think this is about, Lewis?" Lewis hesitated. "I'm just saying, Chief, that maybe." "No," Michael interrupted, his voice firm. "This isn't about coddling them. This is about accountability. Something this department has lacked for far too long." Parker spoke up again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Chief, we're sorry." Michael looked at him, and for a moment, the weight of it all settled over him. The apology wasn't enough, but it was a start. He could see the fear in their eyes, the realization that their actions had real consequences. But fear alone wasn't going to change anything. "You'll be sorry for a long time," Michael said finally. "But that's not enough. You need to be better." The room fell silent again, the tension heavy in the air. Michael turned to leave, but before he reached the door, he paused and looked back at the three men. "Change is coming to this department," he said quietly. "And you'd better be ready for it." With that, he walked out, the door closing behind him with a quiet click. As he walked down the hallway, his mind raced. There was so much work to be done, not just with Parker and Roberts, but with the entire department. The corruption, the racism, the systemic failures, it all needed to be addressed. And he was the man who had to do it. He stopped in front of the chief's office, the door still marked with his predecessor's name. Tomorrow, it would bear his own. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. The atmosphere in the precinct was thick with tension. Michael's footsteps echoed as he made his way down the corridor towards his office. Every eye in the building seemed to follow him, some curious, some nervous, but all aware of the change that was coming. He could feel the weight of their stares, but he didn't let it slow him down. As he entered his office, Parker and Roberts were already seated. They looked smaller than he remembered, the arrogance that once cloaked them now replaced by unease. Their backs were rigid, eyes darting around the room like they were searching for an escape. Michael closed the door quietly behind him and walked around to his desk, deliberately taking his time before he sat down. He folded his hands in front of him and met their eyes one by one, letting the silence stretch until it became unbearable. Roberts was the first to break. "Chief, Quiet." Michael's voice was calm but firm, leaving no room for interruption. "We're not going to start this conversation with excuses. I don't want to hear them." Robert swallowed hard and leaned back in his chair, exchanging a nervous glance with Parker, who had been silent, his face pale. "I didn't call you in here for a repeat of what happened last week," Michael continued, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You know what you did. You know why it was wrong. This meeting is about what happens next." Parker shifted in his seat, finally finding his voice. "Chief, we've been thinking about what you said. About our behavior. And we—" "Stop," Michael interrupted again, his voice low but commanding. "This isn't about thinking. It's about change." Parker's mouth shut, and he sank deeper into his chair, clearly uncomfortable under the weight of Michael's gaze. Roberts tried to speak again but thought better of it and remained silent. Michael leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the desk. "This department is broken. You two are part of the problem, but you're not the only ones. The culture here, the casual racism, the abuse of power, it's not going to be swept under the rug anymore. That stops now." Both men sat in stunned silence, their faces a mixture of guilt and fear. "There are two ways we can handle this," Michael continued, his voice never wavering. "I could fire you both. You could lose everything, your jobs, your pensions, your reputations. And trust me, after what you did, no other department would touch you." Parker opened his mouth to protest, but Michael's eyes flashed, and he thought better of it. "Or," Michael said, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms, "you can make a choice. You can stay here. But if you do, things are going to be very different. You're going to be held accountable, and you're going to earn your place back." Roberts blinked, his confusion clear. "What do you mean, earn it back?" Michael's gaze sharpened. "I mean you're going to be retrained. You'll be working with the community, the same people you've looked down on for so long. You'll attend workshops, sensitivity training, and spend time in the neighborhoods you've neglected. You will learn to see the people you're supposed to protect. And if I hear one complaint, one misstep, you're out. No second chances." Parker looked shocked, his eyes wide. That's not what I expected." "No, I'm sure it's not," Michael said dryly. "You expected a slap on the wrist and a quiet return to your old ways. But that's not happening." Roberts glanced at Parker, uncertainty crossing his features. "And if we say no?" Michael's expression hardened. "Then you can pack your things today. The choice is yours." Silence fell over the room again. The weight of Michael's ultimatum hung heavy in the air. Parker stared at his hands, clearly struggling with the decision, while Roberts's jaw clenched, his face flushed with frustration. Parker finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I want to stay. I want to change." Michael studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Good. You'll have a chance to prove that." Roberts, however, wasn't as quick to accept. His fists clenched, and he stared at Michael with barely contained anger. "You're asking us to humiliate ourselves. To grovel." "I'm asking you to do your job," Michael replied, his voice steady. "The way it should have been done all along. If you see that as humiliation, maybe you're not cut out for this after all." Roberts opened his mouth to argue, but the words died in his throat. He knew Michael was right. But the idea of submitting, of admitting he was wrong, was too much to bear. His pride bristled against it. Parker leaned over, whispering urgently to him. "Come on, man. We don't have a choice." Roberts hesitated, his face a storm of emotions. Then, with a deep breath, he finally spoke. "Fine. I'll do it." Michael nodded once, satisfied. "Good. Starting tomorrow, you'll both be assigned to the Community Outreach Unit. You'll report directly to me, and you'll be working on rebuilding trust with the people in this city. Trust you helped destroy." Parker and Roberts both looked grim, but they nodded in agreement. Michael stood, signaling the end of the meeting. "You're dismissed. I suggest you use the rest of the day to think about the work ahead. It's not going to be easy." As they stood to leave, Roberts hesitated at the door, turning back to Michael. Why are you giving us this chance? You could have ruined us." Michael met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "Because change doesn't come from destroying people. It comes from showing them a better way." Roberts held his gaze for a moment longer before nodding and walking out of the office with Parker trailing behind him. Once they were gone, Michael sat back down, the weight of the day pressing on him. This was only the beginning. There were so many more officers, so many more issues to address. But he had taken the first step, and that mattered. His phone buzzed on the desk, pulling him from his thoughts. He picked it up, his brow furrowing as he read the message. It was from Lewis. "Chief, we need to talk. Now." Michael stood, slipping the phone into his pocket. He had expected this. Lewis had been distant ever since the incident with Parker and Roberts, and it was only a matter of time before he confronted him. He made his way down the hall, finding Lewis in one of the briefing rooms, pacing anxiously. The older man looked up as Michael entered, his face drawn with tension. "Chief," Lewis began, his voice tight, "I've been with this department for 30 years. I've seen good men come and go, and I've watched this place change, for better and worse." Michael folded his arms, waiting for him to get to the point. "I don't agree with everything that's happened here," Lewis continued, his gaze fixed on the floor. "But I've always believed in loyalty. Loyalty to my team, to my officers." Michael raised an eyebrow. "And where has that loyalty gotten you?" Lewis looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and frustration. "I don't know anymore. I thought I was doing the right thing, keeping the peace, making sure things didn't blow up. But after what happened with Parker and Roberts..." He trailed off, unable to find the words. Michael's voice was calm but firm. "Loyalty is important, Lewis. But if you're loyal to the wrong things, it's just another form of corruption." Lewis's shoulders slumped, the weight of years of compromise settling on him. "What would you have me do, Chief?" Michael stepped closer, his eyes intense. "You're a good cop, Lewis. I've seen that. But you've let too much slide. You've allowed this place to rot from the inside out because you thought it was better than making waves." Lewis nodded slowly, his eyes downcast. Michael placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's time to make waves. You're either with me, or you're part of the problem. What's it going to be?" Lewis met his gaze, the conflict clear in his eyes. But after a long, tense moment, he straightened up, his jaw set with determination. "I'm with you, Chief." Michael nodded, relief washing over him. He had gained an ally, one with years of experience and respect within the department. It was a small victory, but an important one. "We have a lot of work to do," Michael said, his voice softer now. "I know," Lewis replied, a hint of a smile crossing his lips. "Let's get started." As they left the room together, Michael knew this was only the beginning. The road ahead was long, and the fight would be hard. But with every step, with every difficult conversation, they were building something new. Something better. And that was worth fighting for. Michael sat at his desk, staring at the paperwork in front of him, but his mind was elsewhere. He had managed to bring some accountability into the department, but it was only the beginning. The reforms, the tension with Parker and Roberts, the strained dynamics between the officers, it was all piling up. Today, however, he knew there would be no more time for delay. It was time to face everything head-on. He heard a knock at the door and called for the person to enter. Sergeant Lewis walked in, his expression tight with concern. Michael could tell that the events of the past few days had weighed on him, as they had on everyone. "Chief," Lewis began cautiously, "they're ready." Michael nodded, standing up and buttoning his jacket. "Let's get this over with." Lewis paused, watching Michael with a mixture of loyalty and doubt. "Do you think they'll go through with it?" "They have to," Michael replied, his voice steady but grim. "If they want to stay here, they have no choice." They walked together down the corridor, where Parker and Roberts were waiting. Both officers stood stiffly, their faces drawn with tension. It was clear that the past few weeks had been humbling for them, but Michael wasn't sure if that would be enough to truly change them. "Officers," Michael greeted them, his tone formal. "Let's take a walk." Without a word, they followed him out of the precinct, Lewis trailing behind. The streets outside were bustling, people going about their day, unaware of the drama unfolding behind the doors of their local police department. It was a clear, crisp day, but the tension between them made the air feel heavy. Michael led them through a neighborhood not far from the precinct, one that had been largely ignored by the department for years. It was a place where people had long since stopped trusting the police, where officers only showed up when there was trouble, and even then, it wasn't to help. They arrived at a community center, the hub of local activity. Kids played basketball outside, while parents watched from nearby benches. The sight of the police officers caused a noticeable shift in the atmosphere. Conversations quieted, and wary eyes turned toward them. Michael stopped in front of the center and turned to Parker and Roberts. "This is where it starts." Parker shifted uncomfortably. "What do you mean?" "You're going to spend a day here," Michael said, his tone matter-of-fact. "Getting to know the people you're supposed to protect. Listen to their stories. Understand their struggles. And then we'll see if you're ready to be real officers." Roberts's eyes widened, the skepticism clear on his face. "You want us to hang out with them?" Michael's gaze hardened. "I want you to learn from them. And I want them to learn from you. If you can't do that, then you don't belong in this department." Parker swallowed hard, his discomfort evident. "Chief, this feels like punishment." "It's not punishment," Michael replied sharply. "It's education. And if you see it as anything less than that, you've already failed." Before either of them could protest further, a group of teenagers approached the community center's entrance, eyeing the officers warily. One of the teens, a tall boy with a basketball under his arm, stopped a few feet away from Parker and Roberts. "What are they doing here?" the boy asked, his tone filled with suspicion. Michael stepped forward, his voice calm but authoritative. "They're here to listen. And maybe learn something. Think you can help with that?" The boy raised an eyebrow, glancing at his friends. "We don't talk to cops." Michael nodded, understanding. "I get that. But maybe today, they'll do more listening than talking. Give them a chance." The boy hesitated, then shrugged. "Whatever. It's your call." Michael turned back to Parker and Roberts. "Let's go inside." They walked into the community center together, but the officers clearly felt out of place. The center was alive with activity, kids doing homework, parents chatting with the staff, and community leaders organizing events. It was a world that Parker and Roberts had never bothered to understand, a world they had only ever seen through the lens of policing. Michael gestured to a table in the corner. "Sit there. People will come to talk to you. You listen. That's all." Roberts sat down stiffly, his expression still guarded, while Parker glanced nervously around the room. "You don't want to be here, do you?" Michael asked, his voice low enough that only the two of them could hear. Parker hesitated, then sighed. "I don't know what you expect us to do here, Chief. We're cops. Not social workers." Michael's gaze was steely. "That's exactly the problem. You've forgotten that policing is about people, not just law and order. If you can't reconnect with the people you serve, you don't belong in this job." Parker didn't respond, but the weight of Michael's words hung between them. As the hours passed, people slowly began to approach the table. A mother with 2 young children sat down first, her eyes filled with apprehension as she told them about the time her son had been stopped by the police for no reason other than walking home from school. A community leader spoke next, explaining how the lack of trust in the police had led to an increase in crime, because people were too afraid to call for help. Parker and Roberts listened, though it was clear they were uncomfortable. At times, they tried to justify their actions, to explain away the systemic issues with personal anecdotes, but Michael quickly shut them down, reminding them that today wasn't about defending themselves, it was about understanding. By the end of the day, the officers were visibly drained. They had heard story after story of police misconduct, of community distrust, of lives damaged by the very system they had sworn to uphold. As they walked back toward the precinct, Michael finally broke the silence. "Well?" Parker glanced at Roberts, who remained silent, then back at Michael. "It was eye-opening. I didn't realize how deep it went." "You didn't realize because you never looked," Michael said bluntly. "That's the problem. Policing isn't just about what happens when you're on duty. It's about the impact you leave behind. The people you saw today, they don't see you as protectors. They see you as threats." Roberts finally spoke, his voice quiet. "What are we supposed to do about that?" "Change," Michael replied simply. "You're supposed to change." They arrived back at the precinct, and as the officers began to walk toward the locker room, Michael called after them. "Remember this day," he said, his voice firm. "Because if you go back to your old ways, I'll be the one to remind you." Parker and Roberts exchanged a look but said nothing as they disappeared down the hallway. Sergeant Lewis, who had watched the entire day unfold, approached Michael with a thoughtful expression. "You think they'll actually change?" Michael exhaled, his shoulders heavy with the weight of the question. "I don't know. But they've taken the first step. That's more than I expected." Lewis nodded, then looked down at the ground. "You did good today, Chief. This place, it's starting to feel different." Michael smiled faintly, though there was no joy in it. "It'll take time. And not everyone's going to make it. But as long as we keep pushing, we'll get there." Lewis met his gaze, his eyes filled with respect. "I'm with you, no matter how long it takes." Michael placed a hand on his shoulder, appreciating the loyalty but knowing that their fight had only just begun. The 2 men stood in silence for a moment before Lewis spoke again. "What's next?" Michael looked around the precinct, at the officers who were still hesitant to embrace the changes, at the system that had resisted for so long. "We keep going," Michael said finally. "One day at a time." And with that, they walked back inside, ready to face whatever came next. The day of Michael's first official address to the department had finally arrived. The precinct was buzzing with nervous energy, every officer aware that this speech wasn't going to be business as usual. Michael Carter had been in the building for over a week, making small but pointed changes that left everyone on edge. But now, standing in front of his officers for the first time, he had the full attention of every soul in the room. Parker and Roberts sat in the back, their usual cocky demeanor absent. Instead, their faces were tight with apprehension. They had barely slept the night before, dreading what Michael might say, how public their humiliation might become. Michael stepped up to the podium, adjusting the microphone slightly. The room quieted almost instantly, the tension so thick it was nearly suffocating. "Good morning," he began, his deep voice resonating through the space. He paused, scanning the room. "For those of you who don't know me yet, my name is Michael Carter, and I'm the new chief of police. But I think it's safe to say that most of you do know me, by reputation, if not personally." A murmur rippled through the room, but Michael ignored it, continuing without hesitation. "I didn't come here to play politics," he said firmly. "I came here because this department is broken. And I know that's not what some of you want to hear, but it's the truth." The words landed hard, like a punch to the gut. Several officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one spoke. "This department," Michael continued, "has lost sight of what it means to serve. We've become more focused on authority, on control, than on community. And that stops now." Parker and Roberts exchanged a glance, both of them clearly uneasy. Michael hadn't looked at them directly yet, but they knew it was coming. "Some of you might be thinking that I'm here to tear this place down," Michael said, his voice softening slightly. "But I'm not. I'm here to rebuild it. To make it better. And I can't do that alone." He paused again, his eyes scanning the room. "I need all of you with me. I need you to understand that things are going to change, drastically. But if you're willing to put in the work, if you're willing to be part of the solution instead of the problem, then we can build something great here." There was a long silence, and Michael could feel the weight of their skepticism, their resistance to change. But he wasn't deterred. "This isn't just about race," he continued. "This is about respect. Respect for the people we serve, respect for each other, and respect for the badge. If we can't restore that, then we're lost. And I refuse to let this department go down that road." He let the words hang in the air for a moment before delivering the final blow. "And if any of you aren't up for this, if any of you think that things were just fine the way they were, then I suggest you find another place to work. Because there's no room for complacency here anymore." The silence that followed was deafening. Michael stepped back from the podium, his expression calm but resolute. He had said what needed to be said. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, officers began to stand, some with determination, others with reluctance. Parker and Roberts were the last to rise, their faces pale, but they stood nonetheless. As the officers began to file out, Michael caught Parker's eye. He gave him a slight nod, a signal that their time was coming. Parker looked away quickly, his discomfort evident. Once the room had emptied, Michael made his way back to his office, his mind already shifting to the next steps. There was so much work to be done, but he had laid the foundation. Now it was time to build. He hadn't been at his desk for more than 5 minutes when a knock came at the door. He didn't have to guess who it was. "Come in," he called, leaning back in his chair. The door opened, and Parker and Roberts walked in, their postures stiff and formal. They didn't sit until Michael gestured for them to do so. "Chief," Parker began, his voice tense, "we wanted to talk to you about what happened." Michael raised an eyebrow. "What exactly do you want to talk about?" Roberts cleared his throat, glancing at Parker before speaking. "We've been thinking a lot about everything, about the speech, about what you've been saying. We know we messed up. We know things have to change." Michael said nothing, waiting to see where this would go. Parker leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "We want to be part of that change. We're willing to do whatever it takes." Michael studied them both carefully. He could see the fear in their eyes, the desperation to salvage their careers, but there was something else too, something more genuine. "You say you want to change," Michael said slowly, "but that's not enough. Change doesn't come from words. It comes from action. Are you really ready for that? Parker nodded quickly, while Roberts hesitated for a fraction of a second before following suit. Yes, Chief. We are. Michael leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly. You understand what that means, right? This isn't going to be easy. You're going to have to unlearn a lot of things. You're going to have to confront your own biases, your own mistakes. And you're going to have to earn back the trust of this department and this community. Robert swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. We know. Michael let the silence stretch between them before finally nodding. All right. We'll see. But know this, I'm watching. Every move you make, every decision. If you slip up, if you fall back into old habits, there won't be any second chances. Parker and Roberts both nodded, their faces tight with tension. Good, Michael said, standing up to signal the end of the meeting. You're dismissed. They stood quickly, making their way toward the door. But just before they left, Parker turned back, his expression hesitant. Chief, he began, his voice low, we really are sorry. Michael met his gaze, his expression unreadable. Don't be sorry. Be better. Parker nodded, then turned and walked out with Roberts close behind. Once they were gone, Michael sat back down, the weight of the day settling over him. He had made progress, but he knew it was only the beginning. Changing a culture, especially one as deeply ingrained as this, would take time, patience, and relentless effort. He closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself a brief moment of respite. Then his phone buzzed, pulling him back into the present. It was a message from one of the community leaders he had been working with. We appreciate what you're doing, Chief. But trust takes time. People are still wary. Be patient with us. Michael smiled faintly at the message. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path. He typed out a quick response. I understand. We'll get there. Together. As he put the phone down, he took a deep breath and stood, ready to face whatever came next. This was just the beginning, but it was a beginning worth fighting for. Michael sat in his office, his hands folded on the desk as he waited. The air was thick with anticipation, and the silence in the room felt like the calm before a storm. He knew what today meant. This was the moment where everything would come to a head, the culmination of weeks of hard decisions, confrontations, and challenges. His reforms were already in motion, but today would decide the future for some key players. A knock echoed through the office, and Michael exhaled slowly. Come in. The door creaked open, and Sergeant Lewis stepped in, followed closely by Parker and Roberts. The two officers wore the same stiff expressions they had carried since that fateful day in the electronics store. Their once cocky demeanors had been replaced by something more subdued, more reflective, but Michael wasn't sure if it was true remorse or just fear of what was coming. Have a seat, Michael gestured toward the chairs in front of his desk, his tone calm but commanding. Parker and Roberts exchanged glances before sitting down. Lewis remained standing near the door, his face unreadable, but there was a weight in his posture that spoke of the moral conflict he had been wrestling with for weeks. For a moment, no one said anything. The room felt too small for the tension that hung between them. Michael leaned back in his chair, letting the silence stretch just long enough to unsettle them. Finally, he spoke. I'm not going to sugarcoat this. The choices you made, the way you handled yourselves, it was wrong. And we all know that. Parker swallowed hard, his hands clenched together in his lap. Roberts, ever the more defensive of the two, shifted in his seat, his jaw tight. Michael could see the anger still simmering just below the surface, but it was tempered now by the fear of consequences. You two put this department in jeopardy, Michael continued, his voice low and steady. You put this community in jeopardy. And you lost their trust. What I need to know now is, do you understand the gravity of what you did? Parker was the first to speak. Chief, we've thought about it, a lot. And we know we messed up. We let our biases get in the way, and we didn't treat you, or anyone else, the way we should have. Michael's gaze didn't waver as he turned to Roberts, waiting for his response. There was a long pause before Roberts finally spoke, his voice clipped and tense. We didn't realize how deep this went. The mistrust, the damage. We thought we were just doing our jobs, but we see now that it was more than that. Michael nodded slightly, letting their words sink in. It's one thing to say the right things, he said quietly, but words aren't enough. Change doesn't come from just saying you're sorry. It comes from actions. Robert stiffened slightly, the muscles in his jaw tightening. What do you want from us? Michael's eyes flashed. What I want is for you to prove that you can be better. That you can do your jobs the right way. And if you can't, then I don't need you in my department. Parker's face paled, and he leaned forward in his chair, his voice urgent. We want to change, Chief. We do. We just need a chance to prove it. Michael leaned back, considering them for a long moment. I'm not here to ruin your careers, he said finally. But I'm also not going to let you off the hook. What happens next is up to you. Roberts frowned, his frustration barely concealed. So what's the plan, then? You've already put us through community outreach, sensitivity training, what more do you want? Michael's expression hardened. You think that's enough? That just sitting through a few workshops makes up for years of bias, for the damage you've caused? That's the problem right there, you think this is something you can check off a list and move on from. Roberts opened his mouth to protest, but Michael cut him off with a sharp wave of his hand. This isn't about ticking boxes. This is about changing who you are as officers, as people. And that takes time. A lot of time. Parker, sensing the tension rising, quickly jumped in. We're willing to put in that time, Chief. We are. We've already started, haven't we? Michael gave a small nod. You've started. But starting isn't enough. You need to keep going, even when it's uncomfortable. Even when it forces you to confront parts of yourself that you don't like. He stood up then, walking slowly around the desk to stand in front of them, his presence looming larger than ever. So here's what's going to happen, Michael said, his voice cool and authoritative. You're both going to continue working under the community program. You're going to be involved in every aspect of rebuilding the trust this department has lost. You're going to spend time with the very people you've ignored, you've mistreated. And you're going to do it with respect. Parker nodded quickly, while Roberts shifted uncomfortably, his expression one of reluctant acceptance. And if I hear one word, Michael continued, his eyes locking onto Roberts, if I hear that you've fallen back into old habits, if I hear that you've treated anyone with anything less than the respect they deserve, then you're done. Both of you. Parker's face was tight with tension, but he nodded again, his voice quiet. We understand. Michael stepped back, folding his arms across his chest. This is your last chance. Don't waste it. There was a long pause before Robert spoke again, his voice subdued but still laced with a hint of defiance. And what about you, Chief? You talk about change, but what about the rest of this department? What about all the others who've been doing the same thing for years? Michael's eyes narrowed. You let me worry about that. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it's going to happen. And it starts with you. Robert said nothing, but the frustration in his posture was clear. Parker glanced at him before speaking again, his tone almost pleading. We just want to do our jobs, Chief. We want to do better. Michael gave a slow nod, his expression softening just slightly. Then show me. Every day. With that, the meeting was over. Michael watched as the two officers stood and made their way to the door, their steps heavy with the weight of what had just been said. Sergeant Lewis, who had remained silent throughout the entire conversation, finally stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. You think they'll make it? Lewis asked quietly once Parker and Roberts had left the room. Michael sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. I don't know. I think Parker wants to change. But Roberts, he's got a long way to go. Lewis nodded, his gaze following the door where the two officers had disappeared. He's stubborn. But maybe that's exactly what makes him worth the effort. Michael raised an eyebrow, intrigued by Lewis's perspective. How do you figure? Because, Lewis said, a faint smile crossing his lips, the ones who resist the hardest are often the ones who need it the most. If he fights this, it means he knows something needs to change. He just doesn't know how to accept it yet. Michael considered that for a moment, then nodded slowly. Maybe you're right. But that doesn't mean it's going to be easy. Lewis chuckled softly. Nothing worth doing ever is. There was a brief silence before Michael spoke again, his tone more reflective. This whole thing, it's been harder than I thought. The resistance, the pushback, it's like everyone's so afraid of change that they'd rather let this place rot than fix it. Lewis sighed, his face filled with the wisdom of years spent in a broken system. Change scares people, especially when it forces them to look at themselves. But you've already done more in a few weeks than most people would in a lifetime. Don't forget that. Michael smiled faintly, though there was no joy in it. Thanks, Lewis. But we're not there yet. Not even close. Lewis nodded, his respect for Michael evident. We'll get there. One way or another. Michael glanced at his watch, then back at Lewis. All right, let's get back to it. We've got work to do. And with that, the conversation was over. But as they stepped out of the office and back into the precinct, Michael couldn't help but feel the weight of the journey ahead. There would be more confrontations, more hard decisions, and plenty of moments where the path forward seemed impossible. But for the first time in a long time, Michael felt like he wasn't walking it alone. And that was enough for now.